Okay, then now it's okay. We can start.
So good evening to everyone, and good morning to those people who are in USA and other Canada. So before we begin this particular meet, we pay homage to the freedom fighters who are sacrificed their life for the cause of right to self-determination in all other countries. So let us pay homage in silence for a minute, and then we assure our effort to them so that we continue to fight for self-determination, right to self-determination. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for paying homage to these freedom fighters. Now I welcome all the participants, particularly the speakers, Professor Saraswati, social activist and a retired professor in Queen Mary's College, Chennai, Tamil Nadu, India. And Lydia Marcosian, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Armenia Occidental. And Mrs. Niruja Tavanesan, human rights activist. And Mrs. Dora Korim, human rights activist, Southern Comoran. And Dr. Fernand the Baroness Doyen. So all these speakers, erudite speakers and experienced speakers, we are very happy to have you all with us. This is really a marvelous, it is a very privilege to have you, and particularly Doyen, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on minority issues. Really, it is a very interesting, very informative, and very good guidance that you give us. So therefore, all these erudite speakers, I really warmly welcome in the name of all the participants here. Welcome to all of you. And I welcome all the participants all over the country, all over the world, with all their heavy schedule, they are able to participate in this particular meet. And really, it is an enriching experience that we can have. So therefore, I welcome all the participants who are physically present here, so that we enjoy to get the inputs from these speakers, and then so that we launch into the action and affirm and achieve the right to self-determination. Thank you. Now, the purpose of this particular meet, why at all we have this particular meet? The first one is to affirm and achieve the right to self-determination in minor countries, nations, and minorities. So it is our birthright that we need to have this particular thing. Secondly, the fascism and the communalism and fundamentalism very systematically annihilates minorities and their rights. So it is very systematic way of doing that. At the same time, they also engender family rule, discrimination, and slavery. It's a very, very clearly it is a practice. For example, in Sri Lanka, a family rule is actually reigns over the majority. The third one, how to collaborate with other minor nations and groups for the achievement of the right to self-determination, with the able guidance and the inputs our speakers they are going to give. It is in order to initiate a collaborative, a collective effort to achieve this right to self-determination, so that we can enjoy the our rights in our countries. So therefore, for these three reasons, we have this particular meet And it is a great privilege to have all these good speakers, and then we can enjoy their inputs, and we can interact with them in order to have a clear clarifications. Now, first the speakers will present their ideas, the opinions and thoughts. Then at the end of their sharing, we'll have discussions so that get clarified in order to have right orientations. So therefore, now first I invite Professor Saraswati, the social activist from Tamil Nadu. So she will share her experiences and thoughts on right to self-determinations. Welcome, Professor Saraswati.
You have to unmute yourself, Professor.
You can unmute your Professor Saraswati, you can unmute.
Yeah. Now
yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Father, for inviting me to this meeting. Let me wish a good day to all of those present in the meeting. Well, the term minority is to me a relative term. Particular group which is a minority in one country may be a majority in some other country. For example, in India, Hindus are the majority and Christians and Muslims are the minority. But elsewhere, like Pakistan, Muslims are the majority and Hindus are the minority. What's important, most important is that it's not whether a particular group is a majority group or minority group. Human rights are more important. And in a democratic country, the human rights of each and every individual should be guaranteed. That's what we call a democratic government, which is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Even in India, of late, we see how the minority groups, people are discriminated, and their fundamental rights are violated, and sometimes even the basic human rights are denied to them. If if one individual denies the basic human right to another individual, well, it could be solved by the court. But when the government itself has taken sides and support the majorities against the minorities, then where else the people would go to get help, support, or justice for them? Well, that is what is happening in India and our neighboring country, Sri Lanka. I'm a person who is associated with the EM issue for the past 20 or 30 years. Well, EM is a distinct entity in the sense that they are a nation, and they exist there right from time immemorial. And even if before the Britishers came, there were two distinct kingdoms in Sri Lanka. One was ruled by the Tamil kings, and the other was ruled by, say, the Sinhala Buddhist kings. And they were living there from time immemorial. And it is the Britishers who, for the sake of their administrative convenience, like what they did in India, well, merged the two nations into one and named it Sri Lanka. So they were there for 150 years. So long as the Britishers were there, well, these two nations, namely the Sinhala Buddhists and the Tamils, were subjects, and as subjects, they were equal. They considered themselves as equal to each other. But once the Britishers left the soil, left Sri Lanka, giving the powers in the hands of the single majority, like what they do in every colonial country, single majority. Well, the Sinhalese started thinking that they alone have the right to rule over the country, and they are they alone are the citizens of the country. So at the time of independence, well, what the Tamils expected was just a parity treatment, parity status. But when that parity status was denied to them, they started demanding at least a federal set of form of government in which they could exercise their rights, they could express their rights. But even when that was denied, they started agitating against the basic violation of the human rights in a non-violent form. But this non-violent form of struggle, which we call as Gandhian form of Gandhian Ahimsa method, and this non-violent form of struggle was answered with bullets and violence, they had no go. And you know, I mean, this non-violent form of struggle was there for 50 years, and with no accepted results for the Tamils. Therefore, they started answering the bullet with bullets, and that's what that's what was called militant struggle came into existence. What I am saying is, even I mean, the Tamils of Sri Lanka had the traditional homeland right from even before Christianity came into existence. And they had the distinct language, they had the distinct culture, they have their culture, and they have a well-defined territory to live in, integrated territory to live in. And as per the modern day definitions, well, they are a nation. So a nation, if they feel happy to live with other nations, and if the government of the country treats them equal on a par with others, well, they can happily live there. But once discrimination starts, once their basic and fundamental rights are violated, even the human rights were violated by the ruling government, then they had no other go but to claim for self-determination. Well, this is what has happened in Sri Lanka. And for the past so many 72 years, the Sri Lankan Tamils are agitating for the right of self-determination. And this is not acceptable to the ruling government. And you know what happened there, genocide took place. 72 years of systematic genocide on the Tamils in Sri Lanka has resulted in a Holocaust. And now the Tamils of Sri Lanka has taken shelter in distant lands. And as such, well, nearly a lakh of people had crossed the sea and they come over to Tamil Nadu and they remain in the refugee camps. Father knows pretty well what's taking place in refugee camps in Sri Lanka. They are denied their basic rights, they are threatened, they are not treated with human dignity, and still, or even after 33 years, well, they are not accepted as citizens of India, and the basic right to education and other things are systematically denied. If this continues, we will have a big problem of the Sri Lankans, and that is why the right solution to them would be the right to self-determination. They have a right as a people, as a nation, to demand their self-determination, and this has been accepted by the UN also. The UN, after the Second World War, has clearly stated it is said that the purpose of UN was to develop friendly relations among various among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of people. So when UN has accepted this, and when UN has given a clear definition about what a nation is, what a nation or what a people is, well, what prevents the international community to do something to make Sri Lanka Tamils accept self-realization? The UNESCO very clearly says that the different criteria that make a people as a nation is cultural homogeneity, linguistic unity, regional ideological affinity, common historical tradition, territorial connection, and common economic existence. Well, all these 6 criteria are there for our Tamils, and it's high time that the United Nations takes appropriate action to uh, grant the status of subject, grant the right to self-determination to the Edom Tamils. And of course, the sufferings of the refugees in different countries in the globe was well known to all of us, and indignity that they are meeting out and the violence that is unleashed on them, all is there in history. And therefore, if we want justice to be done to Edom Tamils, well, I think self-determination is the only answer for their human living. That's all.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
all
you very
from-
much, Professor Saraswati. Beautifully, you have explained the historical situation, how the denial, historically, they were denied their rights. So therefore, they are aiming that it is the right to self-determination. So thank you very much. Thank you. So beautifully, you have presented. Now I call upon Mrs. Lydia McGraw.
Yes. Hello, Professor. Thank you for inviting me to speak today, and thank you to all the organizers who have been organizing this session, which is crucial for the rights of the remaining peoples who live under occupation still. So I am Lydia Margossian. I'm representing the government of Western Armenia in its Western foreign affairs, in general. And so I have been requested in presenting for 10 minutes my presentation. So I will be presenting you what it is at stake for the moment concerning the Armenian people of Western Armenia and the Armenian people in general, and what is their overall situation. We have first of all to consider that the Armenian people is a very ancient indigenous people on its land. It's a very old nation for over 10,000 years on their lands. And their lands is called the Armenian Plateau. And this plateau, for the ones who don't know where it's located exactly, this plateau is located between the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. And the highest point of this Armenian plateau, maybe if you have heard about that, is the Mount Massis, who culminates at more than 5,000 meters. Armenia is the only modern country to be represented on the oldest map of the world, which is the Babylonian map dating from the 6th century before Jesus Christ. So you can imagine that this very old state in the world, we can even say that it has the status of the first state in the world, the first state in the world. And that from this situation, it can be inferred that Armenia is surely the basis of the recognition of other states. This plateau has been the object of the conquest of the empires, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Arabs, etc. But the Armenian people have always been able to free themselves from the successive dominations. But then in 1016, the Turkish hordes led several campaigns towards Armenia from Central Asia. And the sole purpose of these invasions was looting and plundering and then settling on the conquered territories. In sum, the majority of Armenian territory was conquered and colonized as a result of empire territories. The western part of Armenia was conquered and colonized as a result of empire politics. The western part of Armenia was conquered by the Turks, and the eastern part was conquered by Russia in the modern history in 1830s. So what is the situation today of Armenia? Today, we have the Republic of Armenia, which gained its independence after the fall of the Soviet Union, and which has a seat in the UN. But the large part of the Armenian territory, which is Western Armenia, remains under Turkish colonization and occupation. So it's been 100 years that the Armenian people are under colonization and occupation. And maybe, of course, you know what happened to the Armenian people is the genocide of the Armenian people by 3 successive Turkish governments, the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks, and Mustafa Kemal. And you have 2 million Armenians which were exterminated. And the qualification of genocide was forged by Raphael Lemkin and was codified in international law based on the case of the extermination of the Armenians. But at the end of World War I, and based on the sufferance of the Armenian people and based on his history, we had the recognition of a state, the state of Armenia as a whole. And this Armenia, who was recognized in 1920, is today called Western Armenia. And it's distinct from the Armenian Republic of the Caucasus, the eastern part, which gained its independence following the dismantling of the Soviet Union in 1991. That is to say that the state of Western Armenia is the continuation of the state of Armenia recognized in 1920 after a long period of cease of representativity. And the Armenian people also gained other rights, and these rights are based on the Treaty of Sèvres. This Treaty of Sèvres is very important to understand that treaty because it allows you to understand what are the wars today in the Middle East. And because the rights of the Armenians have not been applied concerning this Treaty of Sèvres, is the reason why we have all today's wars occurring in the Middle East. There you have a number of states today which have a seat in the UN based on this Treaty of Sèvres, which is a treaty of peace. But concerning the Armenian part, this treaty has never been applied. So in international law, someone has to explain me how a treaty which has not been ratified is applied, though, for a number of countries, but not applied for the Armenian people, which is a very big injustice for the Armenian people. So when we talk about self-determination, we have to implement the mechanisms of self-determination by yourself. And what is the process of the national reconstitution of the Armenian, of Western Armenia? After the genocide, 100 years have passed, and we had to recover ourselves. Our grandfathers and fathers had to recover ourselves from that genocide. And 100 years after, now we are doing that process of national reconstitution. What does it mean to do that reconstitution when you have been under occupation, when you have undergone genocide? So what we did is, based on all the rights that we obtained in 1920 during our Independence Day, which is the 19th of January 1920, we did that government of Western Armenia 100 years after, and I repeat myself, is the continuation of that state, of the Armenian state, recognized in 1920. So this structure of the state of Western Armenia has been formed, and its foundation is the National Council of Western Armenia, which declared its existence in Shushi in 2004. The government of Western Armenia now, as a subject of international law, establishes direct relations with other states and national governmental, and participates in the activities of international organizations. In 2006, the National Council of Western Armenia, the only political body representing the Armenians of Western Armenia, registered the Assembly of Armenians of Western Armenia at the United Nations in order to defend the rights of the Armenian nation recognized by 144 states within the framework of the expert mechanism of the rights of indigenous peoples. And I have the honor to tell you that Mr. Armen Aga is the first elected president of Western Armenia in 2013, and he still is. The surviving Armenians still living in occupied Western Armenia are continuing.
Please unmute, Lydia, please unmute. You have to unmute yourself.
You are
The mic,
Okay,
on the mic.
sorry. Thank you very much. And the Armenians of Western Armenia, survivors of the genocide, were uprooted from their ancestral land and scattered throughout the world, and today is largely in exile without a restorative justice. Other mechanism of applying your right of self-determination is the possibility of becoming a citizen of the state of Western Armenia for all our people living all around the world. And it's a mechanism that offers every Armenian the possibility of implementing his or her rights to self-determination. This is very crucial and important because it's only within a state that you can apply your rights. And Western Armenia couldn't have been possible, it couldn't have been possible to ratify the Treaty of Sèvres from the part of Western Armenia if we wouldn't be a state. So international law is very crucial for the rights of the nations and minorities in self-determination. So I'm going to end my presentation telling you in 2 minutes what is the current situation of the Armenian people. We have to understand and to realize that the various genocidal programs against the Armenian population, in fact, have never stopped. Most recently, on September 27, 2020, the indigenous Armenian population of Artsakh was and continues to be subjected to a war of aggression by Turkish Azeri armed forces. And we call them terrorists because they have been using terrorist forces. This genocidal war of aggression deliberately targeted the Armenian civilian population, has resulted in more than 6,000 deaths in 44 days, you can imagine, and the loss of the 3/4 of the territory of Artsakh, which is part of Western Armenia in international law. No resolution of the conflict will be possible without the inclusion of Western Armenia in the peace talks of the OSCE and the Minsk group. Indeed, the eastern border of Armenia, when I'm talking about Armenia, I'm talking about the whole Armenia, and the Armenia of Western Armenia, recognized in 1920, should be determined on the basis of Article 92 of the Treaty of Sèvres. This means that the issues related to the rights to self-determination are eminently related to international law. I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer every question that you could have. And once again, thank you for all the organizers for holding this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We are really articulated the real situation in Armenia. It's beautifully you have explained. Really, I'm so happy because you have expressed the geographical location of Armenia. That's very important because many of us may not know where it is exactly. Then in the genocide in Armenia, Then you have very clearly expressed the
Thank you.
independence of Armenia and the mechanism that is used for a right to self-determination and the current situation in Armenia. So very beautifully expressed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much joining us, and you really
Thank you
have
to you.
contributed a
Thank
lot.
you to you, Professor.
I request all the speakers, can you, if possible, can you send the written text to us so that it will be useful for future actions? Yeah, please remind, keep in your mind, please send the written text. That would be great because you have so much work and it's enlightening us. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. So now I invite Mrs. Dora Corin, the Southern Cameroon human rights activist, really is with a full vigor. She is able to do and articulate their real rights. So I welcome Dora. Dora, unmute. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening to wherever you're joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about the Southern Cameroon's problem. What is the Southern Cameroon's problem? The question is, did the state of Southern Cameroon ever exist? I want to put my questions and my answers so that maybe some clarity can be made so that people can see. Yes, the state of Southern Cameroon existed from 1954 to 1961 as a quasi-legislative state under a democratic form of governance with free and fair election, as a parliamentary a form of governance with a prime minister. That is the truth about the Southern Cameroon state. And the next question is, does the Southern Cameroon has defined boundaries? Yes, the Southern Cameroon has defined and recognized boundaries clearly demarcated by the treaties of the United Nations Organization. And the evidence of these boundaries can be seen in 3 different locations. Throughout my life and my travel in places like Europe and other West African states, I have never seen a country that has internal custom posts. But if you go to the Cameroons, you will realize that their internal custom posts, and these custom posts also occur, or they were created on the boundaries between the Southern Cameroons and French Cameroon. So it is a proof that there are 3 boundaries of Southern Cameroon that can be located, 3 custom posts. And that is one thing that we call on the United Nations to pay attention to this, because till present date, all the children in Southern Cameroon that were born from 1961 to present date are away, because these custom posts are internally located. It tells us that there are 2 different countries, because a custom is always the first officers you meet at the border of entry into every country. And they are located where we have this United Nations pillars in Minji, in the Mongo, and in Matazin. Those are the custom posts, and those are the places where we have boundaries. So the hopes that Cameroon is one and indivisible, it is not true. So we call the United Nations and the international community to pay attention to that. So moreover, neglecting the historical and territoriality of the Southern Cameroons, they will fail to address the root causes of the problem, because I believe sustainable peace, justice, and development can only thrive if there is sustainable intervention, which requires addressing the root cause of the Southern Cameroon conflict, and understanding the history of the people, and also their territoriality. Are they people? Do they have a territory? Do they have demarcated borders? I think that is the point, because most of the speakers who have spoken before me are speaking the same thing in other words, but we are saying the same thing. So how does this really make Southern Cameroon the Cameroons 2 different places? The first thing is that it has distinct people who have differences in identity, in cultural practices, in their legal system, in their educational system. So we are talking about distinction in hegemony, the French hegemony being practiced by French Cameroon, and that of the English hegemony practiced by the people of the Southern Cameroons. Common law is different from the French law, the French system of law practices. So I want to say something. The people of Southern Cameroons, we are known as the Amazonians, because anything that is attached to Cameroon, based on what Cameroon has done to the people of Southern Cameroons, tends us, we feel bad about it. So we call ourselves Southern Cameroonians or Ambazonians. We are not Anglophones. We are Southern Cameroonians. That's why when somebody said the Anglophone crisis, it gets us irritated because we have never been Anglophones. We have been Southern Cameroonians, and we are Ambazonians, named after the Ambas Bay. That is one of the things. So secondly, I want to say that we expect the United Nations Secretary General as an ethical voice to call an investigation into the Southern Cameroons, because we believe that the United Nations handled the Southern Cameroon as a trust territory under the United Nations. And that is why most Southern Cameroonians are worried about it. We expect the United Nations Secretary General to begin to call out, stand as an ethical voice and talk to people of minority origin. That is very important call. We also want the international community to know that time is the daughter of truth. And also the past never really dies. The past just hides. That is something that's why there's a minority issue. Sometimes it looks very easy, like a walk to the park, because people think that, oh, I'm the majority. If you come from a majority group of people in a country, in a nation, you feel comfortable. But when you come from the minority, it pains, it itches. So that's why we are trying to call on the international community that when we look at the cases of like Czechoslovakia, the Czech and the Slovakians, they discovered that there were two different people and there was a peaceful separation. That is something that is very important that we call on the international community to practice in order to solve the problem of minority. According to the United Nations Resolution 1608, Article 15, on the 25th of April 1961, 64 countries voted in favor of Southern Cameroon's independence. And that independence began, or that independence was supposed to commence as an independent territory, the Southern Cameroons, from the 1st of October 1961. But bear in mind that the French Cameroon had already gotten its independence on the 1st of January 1960. So it already has its own flag, its own borders, but the Southern Cameroons was not yet independent. So it is something that really puts us on the edge, because we wonder what happened to our independence. Voted by the United Nations, 64 nations voted in favor of us, and then we do not have the independence. We don't have a state up to present date, more than 50 years. So that is a problem.
Dora, please unmute. Dora, can you please unmute?
Okay, please. All right, thank you. So French Cameroon joining 23 other states to vote against the Southern Cameroon is a clear proof to show that the Southern Cameroon is not an integral part of French Cameroon. And also Southern Cameroon is an autonomous entity that was separate from the French Cameroon. And it also proves to the people of Southern Cameroon there's a lot of distrust. You voted against our independence, meanwhile you were independent. So it tells us that there was hatred and a hidden ulterior motive behind the scenes, because you hated us to qualify as a sovereign state. Were you planning to annex us in future? That is the question. So there's a lot of misleading information about the people of Southern Cameroon presently and about the Southern Cameroon problem. And that is why most often the international community and individuals who have never bothered to investigate our historical evidence and truths, and they have forgotten to investigate our territoriality if we ever had demarcated borders. Stories like Cameroon is one and indivisible. That is carefully, a cleverly crafted kind of lie to deceive the international community that we are one and indivisible. We call on the United Nations to carry out a fact-finding mission. We even have pictures of our statehood, the kind of companies that existed and our institution. So on our territoriality, we call on the United Nations and the international community to look into it. Some people go around and they say Cameroon had a plebiscite, a referendum in 1972, and it became a united republic. That there was no treaty. It was just a proof to see if the people were willing. And that option of the United Nations telling us to become independent by joining Nigeria or by joining French Cameroon, without giving us the third option, which was outright sovereignty, outright independence, was a big problem. And it's still a big problem, because you can't join two people that cannot join. You can't mix water and oil. There will always be this partitioning. That is something that we have at the back of our mind. And even besides talking of a federation, according to international law, a federation means that two or more people are involved in this federation. It was never reflected on the flag. You see, so you realize that we were never represented. The borders, the boundaries we had was never frozen. So these boundaries still remain the same. So it gives the people of Southern Cameroon a lot of concern. No treaty. Why are we being treated like that? You know, we want to take an example of the people of Southern Cameroon. We also study African history. But history will tell you that the United Republic of Tanganyika, of Tanzania, was made up of Tanganyika, Zanzibar, and Pemba. Those are united. That is united. So when we talk of unity in international law, we're talking about two or more parties. But we didn't see this in the case of Southern Cameroon. You know, these are some of the things that make the people of Southern Cameroon feel bad. The worst of it was in 1982, when one of the longest serving dictators of Africa, his Probia of the La République du Cameroon, turned the state single-handedly without the consent of anyone, without a treaty, into Republic of Cameroon. That is the name of the southern of French Cameroon at its time of independence. So the Southern Cameroon people have no name. You can't join me, and instead of us having two names to represent both of us, we have your name, because it is not a marriage. That was not a marriage. There's a big political issue. So we realized that there was total annexation kind of a process, a kind of annexation, assimilation, according to the French policy of rule, and also colonization in the 21st century. So that was something that we thought that the United Nations stands for human rights, self-determination. And we were wondering what happened to the United Nations that they will ignore the criteria for statehood, like territoriality, and the people of Southern Cameroon, which is completely internationally outlawing, because that is what we thought to ourselves as Southern Cameroonians. And also, we want to think of ourselves like, how did this conflict begin? The conflict began when there was a simple strike between the teachers and the lawyers, trying to impose the French system of education and French law, civil law, in the territory of the Southern Cameroon in the later part of 2016. And on the 30th of November 2017, Dictator Biya of La République du Cameroon declared war on the Southern Cameroon. That is a proof that we're never an integral part of French Cameroon at the time of its independence. No president of a country that is one and indivisible will declare war on another part of that country. That is a clear evidence. I think the international community should be asking them, if we are one and indivisible, why should you declare war on the people of Southern Cameroon? We have a lot of casualties today. The war has a lot of casualties because we have over 2 million people in bushes. We have over plus 3,000 prisoners in jails, 1.2 million people as refugees in Nigeria and across as far as Ghana in West Africa. We have over 30,000 people who are like internally displaced people. That is the order of the day. And that is statistics as per War Refugee Day on the 20th of June, 2021. So the United Nations and the international community has been silent over our refugees and our prisoners because they think it's an internal conflict, of which this is not true, because the records of the Southern Cameroon as a mandate of the United Nations is still in the offices of the United Nations as a mandate, as a territory that was administered as a mandate. So I want to say that the international community has failed to bring pressure on African Refugee Convention to be implemented as regarding our refugees in Nigeria. And we also see that even the committee in charge of internally displaced persons and missing persons has not carried out a proper fact-finding mission, because we have cases of reportedly mass graves. People have not been able to see the trace where their loved ones have been. And this is a cry for the international community to do some fact finding. It is very important to check it out. Is it true that we have 2 internal custom posts or 3 internal custom posts within a country? That is a message to us, the Southern Cameroon people. And I want to say that the international community have been silent over the deportation of the Southern Cameroonians. Like 47 persons were deported from Nigeria. They went there, an outright transgression of the law, including even the leaders of Southern Cameroon. They were deported to Nigeria. And I believe that there are treaties, international treaties, that forbid the deportation of a refugee back to its country in times of war. These are things that we have not seen from the international community and the United Nations as a whole. And we appeal to the United Nations to grant a clear audience to the leaders of Southern Cameroon to listen to our own side of the story. and to even fact check and verify it. Because without listening to the leaders of the people, this conflict will continue to boil in the Gulf of Guinea. There will never be peace and security. But if the United Nations and the representatives, the rapporteurs, can appeal to the United Nations so that they can listen to our leaders, listen to our history, understand the root causes of the problem, then sustainable peace can be attained, because the people of Southern Cameroon are a peace-loving people. So that is what I want to say. Thank you so much, and we are open for questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thora. Really, so very beautifully articulated the demands and the cry of South Cameroon. Really, it is very interesting, and you demanded the United Nations as well as international communities. How do they intervene in this particular case and then affirm their right to self-determination? That's very beautifully articulated. So thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Really, it's interesting to listen to you, and we will collaborate in the future. Now I call upon Miss Niroja Tavanesan, who is a human rights activist and is really involved in the case of the Tamil Eelam. And I request Ms. Niroja to present her views. Niroja, unmute yourself.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, dear colleagues, for this opportunity. It's an honor to be part of this event with our colleagues from Southern Cameroon, Armenia, Occidental, Southern Yemen, and all nations and minorities persecuted by occupants. I wanted to point out few aspects of occupation are facing Ulam Tamils under Sri Lankan new government, and also about the passivity of international community. And also how the oppression is perpetrated on disinformation by oppressor and also by social media like Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, and others. As Professor Saraswati mentioned, Ulam Tamils are facing structural occupation and are facing structural genocide by Sri Lankan security forces. The Ulam Tamils victims have been patiently waiting for last 12 years, especially the victims, the mothers of missing persons, the widows, and the orphans. The international community will ensure the delivered justice accountability with strategy on transitional justice. We are direct witness of Ulam Tamil genocide during Mulliyavaikal. According United Nations intern expert Charles Peretti report, there are more than 70,000 Tamils were killed in May 2009 during the final stage of war. But we are talking of more than 147,000 people who are uncounted between December 2008, December and May 2009, which United Nations mechanism failed to protect our Ulam Tamils from genocide. Sri Lankan military force used chemical weapons, cluster bombs, and lots of non-conventional arms for killing more than 300,000 Tamils from 1980 to 2009. The civil war in which the Tamils fought the Sri Lankan armed force from 1983 until their defeat in May 2009 was marked by tens of thousands of enforced disappearances. We Tamils lost our rights in our own homeland, Tamil Eelam, and we use internet and social media for make awareness on our history of struggles. There are restrictions on operation of website, blogs, application, or any other internet-based electronic or other such information discrimination system, including support system, such as internet service providers or search engines are permissible only to the extent that they are compatible with the condition provided for the curtailment of freedom of expressions. Internet service providers and social media denied Tamil's rights to inform on our genocide and also on our history, denied the recognition of 120 million Tamil, recognize our value and history. Internet exponentially must facilitate the exercise of freedom of expression in all of its dimension, diversifying and multiplying and media and the audience, potentially global, decreasing cost and time, and offering unparalleled condition of the innovation and exercise of both fundamental rights. But unfortunately, for last 10 years, Tamil history of resistance is totally denied and the information are censored in the social media, depriving to the access information to all Tamil across the world. Access to the information is also means by which other rights can be effectively exercised, including the economic, social, and cultural rights of vulnerable historical included, group and civil and political rights. Lack of access to information can contribute to even constitute a violation of other rights enshrined in a convention. Every person has the right to freedom of investigation of opinion and of the expression and dissemination of ideas by medium whatsoever. Article 13, American Convention of Human Rights. Rights to freedom of speech find place various international convention, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, Article 19 of the ICCPR. Everyone shall have the rights to hold opinion without interferences. Everyone shall have the rights to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kind of, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of his choice. The exercise of the right provided for in paragraph 2, this article carry with the special duties and responsibilities. It may therefore be subjected to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and necessary. First, for respect and rights or reputation of others. Second, for the protection of national security or of public order public, or public health or morals. The transformative nature of the internet in terms of giving voice to 120 millions of Tamils around the world, of significantly enhancing their ability to access information, of enhancing pluralism and reporting. The power of internet promote UDHR and realization of the rights and public participation, as well as to facilitate access to good services. Nothing that some government have taken action or put place measures with the specific intention or unduly restricting freedom of expression on the internet, contrary to international law. We, like 120 millions of Tamil community activists from all over the world, have been using Facebook to share our Tamil history, especially Tamil Eelam and Sri Lanka's genocide. We believe that removal and blocking was due to materials of Tamil Eelam history, not knowing which of Tamil Eelam history photos allowed to use on Facebook, YouTube, and other social medias, and which posts are not allowed at, cause many to stay away from sharing their history. We believe this will eventually force to our history to erased completely in future. Unless proper mechanism is developed with international communities, the problem relating to promotion and protecting of all human rights, civil rights, political and economical, social and cultural development, including the rights to development, cannot be solved. We asked to the special rapporteur to have an urgent meeting to social medias, representative and civil society members to have discussion on the libericide actions from social medias. Protect Tamils living in their homeland from Sri Lanka, genocidal politics, and promote the independence and promote the independent investigation to genocidal Elam Tamils against Elam Tamils. Push a referendum for recognize the Tamil rights to self-determination. Thank you for the chance.
Thank you, Ms. Niroja. Beautifully you have articulated the justice for the victims, the accountability of genocide, and the right to information through social media, and the demands of the Tamils. So really, it's very beautifully pinpointed very categorically what should be done by the international community and the UNO. So thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Now I call upon Mr. Saleh from West Yemen. South Yemen. Yeah. Please, you're most welcome to share your views.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah.
First of all, can I express my solidarity with all the causes that we've heard about in this fantastic webinar, and also all the people across the world that are continuing to struggle against oppression and seek freedom and self-determination effectively. Of course, every cause is unique, and listening to these, to my colleagues who have already spoken, every cause has its own unique characteristics. And of course, the cause of South Yemen also has its own characteristics and history, and of course, the complexities that it faces might be different from others, but it remains to be a cause for self-determination that is continuing the struggle today. Maybe briefly, just to give people an idea of the background to the cause of self-determination in South Yemen. Of course, South Yemen, for those who might not be aware of this, was an independent state until 1990. And the decision was taken in 1990 to unify with North Yemen. Now, in hindsight, that was a decision which I think everybody agrees was wrong, because it was a very badly planned unity. There was a lot of contradictions between the two countries, and that was always going to be a recipe for failure of the unity project. Very clearly after 1990, it became obvious that the North Yemen authorities and the North Yemen regime was already planning to effectively overtake the South. The South was perceived to be a place of wealth, and also its geography is far bigger than the North, and also the population is very limited in comparison to that of the North. So at the time, the South Yemen population was 5 million in comparison to about 20 million in the North. So very shortly after the unity, the northern regime began to assassinate southern leaders, and that led to a decision by the southern leadership to try and break away and revoke the unity, because it was clear that this was not a viable project. The northern regime decided to meet those aspirations or decision by waging war against the South. And in 1994, the war known as the 1994 war was waged, and effectively that was the effective occupation of the South by the North. Since then, Southerners have continued to struggle to try and break away, to find a way to solve the problem of unity, but unfortunately, that was met by oppression and effective occupation until effectively in 2015, when the situation changed completely, in that the government in the North was itself overthrown by a militia from the very north of the North, which was sectarian in its motivation. And that is the basis for the current war. Now, of course, the current war is largely a North-North issue, but the South has been embroiled and continues to be embroiled in that war, even though the South has really no connections, and the roots of the war remain in the North. So effectively, where we are today, we are continuing the struggle. The good thing is that in the South, this war has allowed the Southern people to effectively organize themselves, and we are far better equipped nowadays in terms of the military abilities and also political abilities. There's the Southern cause has now managed to establish what's called the Southern Transitional Council, which is a body that is advocating for Southern independence or self-determination. But it is embroiled in the wider war, unfortunately, and progress has been limited towards the ultimate aim of self-determination. Nevertheless, we feel that we have come a long way. We've started the peaceful movement in the South, which began in 2007, and there was a crackdown on so many activists in the South. But thankfully, we can today say that we are in control of parts of the South, at least effectively. So the capital, Aden, is currently under the control of the Southern Transitional Council, and also areas around the capital of Aden. There's still some areas that are controlled by the government. And of course, the North is controlled by the militias that have overthrown the government. So it's a very complex scenario, Yemen is, and the Southern cause has been embroiled in the complexities of this particular crisis. Nevertheless, we feel that we have made a lot of progress. Now, I'd like to say something about the role of the UN and how ineffective it has been in dealing with the Southern issue over the years, and in particular, most recently, how ineffective it's been in dealing with the Yemen crisis generally. The UN has been very inactive and largely has failed in identifying the root causes of the problems. And its approach to solving the current Yemen crisis has been bilateral, in effect, deeming the crisis to be the militias against the government, the Yemeni government, not realizing there is a Southern cause which has been going on for many years, and which, had it been addressed properly early on, then we may not be in the situation that we are currently. So the UN has had 3 special envoys, and all of whom have completely failed to make any real progress in terms of solving and bringing the war to an end generally, or in terms of identifying the root causes of the problems, including the Southern issue. We now have the US taking more of an active role. They've assigned an American envoy to the conflict, and he has his own, of course, agenda, which clearly any cause for self-determination, as we all know, does not get the support and the recognition that it deserves. However, we in the South have made it clear that there will not be an end to this crisis. There will not be any sustainable peace and stability in Yemen, North and South, and also in the region, without a proper and effective resolution to the Southern question that meets the aspiration of the Southern people. And therefore, any move towards progress towards peace and stability has to has to start with giving the Southern people the right to determine their own destiny. And of course, if that was to be the case, we are confident that the Southern people will overwhelmingly vote or call for independence. Finally, I'd like to say something about the concept of self-determination. It is often embroiled in legalities, and it's often perceived to be a legal concept and becomes dry in the way that it is being discussed, and simply turns out to be a legal argument or embroiled in a legal argument. In fact, what self-determination is a title for the people to be given the right to live with dignity, to live independently, to live without oppression, without being killed, without being displaced. And I think often that is forgotten, and sometimes the cause of self-determination becomes a subject point in a legal argument that often doesn't represent genuinely what the concept is about. And therefore, I think we need to be clear, or we need to be able to bring forward the suffering of the people that are calling for self-determination, and therefore self-determination is only a way to resolve the hardship and suffering that these people experience. Once again, I express my solidarity with all the causes for self-determination throughout the world, and I will be very happy to be part of these seminars and these webinars in the future. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saleh. You beautifully have explained the cry of the South Yemen. It's a good thing that you are. The illegal occupation by the North Yemen and undermining the rights of the South Yemen, and the oppression by the North Yemen. And you demanded the UNO and other international community to listen to the cry of the South Yemen. It's a really beautifully you have articulated well, and you have made a note on the self-determination. It's a dry and what you call legal term. Yeah, that should be reconsidered how to go about and all those things. So thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. Beautifully presented and be part of this particular program. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Now I invite Dr. Fernando de Warnes RP Doyen, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. Really, after listening to all these 5 people, now he would be able to guide, in a position to guide us how to go about, how to work together in order to achieve this right to self-determination, particularly the rights of minorities. So welcome, sir. Welcome.
Eh bien, merci. Bonjour tout le monde. Many thanks for the kind invitation to address this online conference on self-determination. And thank you for sharing with me your stories, the descriptions of the different and sometimes obviously very complex contexts and history of some of the situations that you live in. Before I begin, I wanted to mention that we're holding this year, under my mandate, 4 regional forums on the prevention of violent conflicts and the protection of the human rights of minorities. The first 2 were held online for the Americas in April, and Africa and the Middle East in June, but the next 2 will also be held online for Asia Pacific region on the 7th and the 8th of September, whereas the regional forum for Europe will be held on the 12th and 13th of October. You can find information on that by Googling the regional forums on conflict prevention and the protection of the human rights of minorities. Now, I mention this for 2 reasons. First, because some of you come from regions where you're experiencing a conflict involving a minority. And by the way, I just wanted to make it also clear that in international law, an indigenous people can also, at the same time, constitute a religious, ethnic, or linguistic minority without this affecting their rights to self-determination, and I should add, internal self-determination, as proclaimed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, secondly, because as we are pointing out in the work around the regional forums under my mandate that I just mentioned, what we refer to, what we mention quite often, is the nature of the conflicts in the world today. And I think it's important to mention this. Most conflicts, they are intrastate rather than interstate conflicts. Not all of them, but most. And that means they involve indigenous peoples, and quite often at the same time, they are also an ethnic, linguistic, or religious minority. The vast majority of situations, for example, in 2018, involving instability, even past or attempted genocides, potential crimes against humanity, and similar threats, were against groups that can be described as minorities, according to some data, longitudinal data, prepared by a major research initiative that's been going on for decades called Peoples Under Threat. And this is also one of the main conclusions in the first joint study by the United Nations and the World Bank on preventing conflict, where they recognize, and this is a report from 2018, they both recognize that today's main drivers of instability globally are group-based grievances around exclusion and injustice. And I heard a lot about that. I heard that in some of the presentations that you shared with us earlier. So to quote from that report, it actually concludes or suggests the following. Many of today's violent conflicts related to group-based grievances arising from inequality, exclusion, and feelings of injustice. And it is when an aggrieved group assigns blame to others, or especially to the state for its perceived economic, political, or social exclusion, that these grievances may become politicized and risk tipping into violence. That's from the World Bank and United Nations first joint study. As a matter of fact, I think it's still the only joint study by those two global organizations. And even further than that, and I just want to mention this clearly or initially, since 2010, the number of major conflicts, violent conflicts, has tripled globally. We don't realize how, in fact, conflicts have been increasing around the world. But what perhaps we also need to admit and acknowledge and act towards is that much of the increase is in the rise of intrastate conflicts inside a country, usually involving minorities or indigenous people. And just to reinforce this point, there are more violent conflicts globally than at any other time in the past 30 years right now. And the world is therefore facing some of the largest forced displacement crises that we've ever recorded. Let me emphasize here the connections: peace, stability, and justice. In other words, preventing violent conflicts requires addressing the core grievances of minorities and indigenous peoples. And we've heard some of them. Core grievances associated with their exclusion, discriminatory practices, and we heard that also earlier, in matters of participation in public life in other areas, accommodating their cultures, religions, or belief and languages, as well as dealing effectively, which because it's often not done, dealing effectively with other breaches of their human rights of significance to protect, recognize and protect their existence and identity. So the exclusion and discrimination against minorities, rather than ensuring their inclusion and protection in society through implementing their human rights, well, quite often these are the main root causes of most, I would say even most, contemporary conflicts. So preventing conflicts requires addressing these failures, these root causes, and particularly failures in protecting and implementing human rights. So guaranteeing the protection of the rights, the human rights of minorities and indigenous peoples, and ensuring their implementation before grievances have the chance to fester increases the chances that a conflict might not occur. It's not a guarantee, but these are the pathways to respect the dignity and equality of all persons belonging to different communities to achieve peace, justice, and stability. Now, a final issue I'd like to talk about and suggest, and I'm not the only one who suggests this, is to use a colloquial expression in English, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. If self-determination is good for indigenous peoples, then it could also be as good, as valid for minorities, and particularly what is often described as national minorities in Europe. And I'm not the only one who is suggesting or advancing this argument, because as some of you may know, there was a report issued only a few months ago in March of this year by the permanent mission of the government of Liechtenstein at the United Nations in New York and the Institute on Self-Determination. And I want to mention this because I think it actually has some interesting suggestions as to where we should be going. Now, this report is called the Handbook on the Prevention and Resolution of Self-Determination Conflicts. As I said, it just came out a few months ago, last March. And it includes guidelines on the prevention and the resolution of conflicts, but more to the point, it says this about what you were talking about today. Allow me to quote. And I'll start with perhaps one of the main conclusions. And I quote, community or identity-based grievances relating to self-determination can be addressed at the outset through strong minority and indigenous peoples' human rights protections, measures that effectively uphold the human rights of minorities and indigenous people, can build trust between relevant communities and the state. It can address the forms of inequality, injustice, and exclusion from power, opportunity, services, and security that can often lead to conflict, including those relating to self-determination. So emphasis should be given to measures that ensure the implementation and effective participation of minority and indigenous communities, as well as the influence of their influence over decisions that affect them. This is in line with the SDG 16.7, which aims to ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels, end of quote. Now, it does go actually much further, including on providing guidelines how negotiations for self-determination arrangements with minorities and indigenous people should occur, and the different steps which should be taken, including, and I'll just name a few. One, in helping to resolve ongoing and to prevent future self-determination conflicts, states may consider how arrangements for self-governments could be introduced or extended. Number two, self-government arrangements agreed between states and relevant communities can be either territorial or non-territorial. And three, a dispute resolution mechanism should exist to address questions of legal authority and conflicts over the exercise of that authority between the relevant community and central government. What this study from essentially the government of Liechtenstein suggests is that self-determination, it needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed much more directly, not only in a rather rigid concept, which is traditionally understood in international law, that it applies only to peoples, but peoples in a very restrictive sense. Because those of you with a background in international human rights law will know that usually the concept of a people is actually rather restrictive at the United Nations. And it is only attributed in relation to the entire population of a recognized state by the United Nations, or in an even more restricted today context of decolonization. What the government of Liechtenstein is involved with is to propose that the concept of self-determination is an evolving concept, and it's true that it has changed since the end of the Second World War, and this evolution has to go further. It has to be enlarged to cover also, let's call them national minorities and indigenous people, to ensure that their place inside the state does respect their effective rights of social and political participation, including rights to forms of autonomy that can be quite extensive, including in some cases even perhaps in forms of diplomatic personality, as happens, for example, in places like Quebec, Canada, or the Åland Islands of Finland. And I think it also highlights, and I'll close with this, it highlights how this is an important evolving tool that I would suggest absolutely is needed for the prevention and resolution of conflicts, something which unfortunately, and we've heard this also, but unfortunately, the United Nations has perhaps been too timid to discuss sufficiently or officially, as we know, because of fears of antagonizing certain governments. But I do hope that the initiative of Liechtenstein might be able to start something, and that we'll consider it in the regional forums that are being organized under my mandates, as I mentioned this year, but also consider the ramifications next year, because I wanted to also mention to you that next year we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities. So I'll stop here, as I think that, first of all, we've heard from all of you already something which is very concrete, that reflects the realities on the ground, as you are much more familiar with, and sometimes even the brutal situations that your communities are experiencing. And once again, I'd like to thank the Global Tamil Movement for their allowing me to join you today on this important discussion, and perhaps thinking about self-determination and engaging on some developing, emerging evolution, which I think is interesting, and perhaps we can look at how we could work together on this. Thank you very much. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Beautifully you have articulated the nature of conflict, how conflict emerges and it is on the increase. And you have experienced the linguistic minority also, how they can go about, how they can live, and the future actions for right to self-determination. You suggested the 3 things. And then you have assured that we can future, we collaborate and we work together. And after listening to the live, what do you call a situation, real situations from the field. And that's why you have been very, very, what do you call docile and accommodative to listen to all these people, and they're ready to collaborate with them. It's really a marvelous work there. So thank you very much. Thank you, really. Thank you for being here and presenting your views on self-determination. Now I request the participants to raise your questions. Maybe the question should be very brief, maybe because so that we don't waste our time. Then particularly to whom you are raising your questions, please you can tell. Then afterwards you raise the questions. The question should be very short, brief, no argument. It's only in a clarifications, or you want to enlighten more by saying that. So you can also ask the question to the Dr. Doyen, the United Nations for minority issues, a special rapporteur for minority issues. So now you can raise your questions by raising your hand. So we follow the order. So now first we'll begin with Madam Lydia. Magos, you can ask. Unmute yourself and then you ask.
Thank you very much, Professor, for letting me ask this question, which is addressed to Mr. De Varenne. Mr. De Varenne, thank you very much for your clarifications upon the definition of self-determination. Of course, the definition can be really enlarged on that point. And I would like to have your opinion about that initiative of Liechtenstein. And I would like to know if this initiative includes the concept of self-determination when it's related to an indigenous people who had a recognized state, which is the case of the Armenian people. The Armenian indigenous peoples is the first people in the world, indigenous peoples in the world. It may be, I don't know if you knew that, but it's the first indigenous peoples that have received a recognition and independence of their state. And I would like to know if in the definition, this concept of self-determination is included, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question. I think I have to clarify that this report, I encourage you to actually access this report. It is available freely online. I think this report is a little bit careful. It talks about what we would describe as internal self-determination for minorities and indigenous people. And it says in its report, and I don't want to suggest that this is the absolute understanding, but my understanding is that the report identifies external self-determination for states that are recognized in international law or in the decolonization process as a very different issue. So I think that needs to be raised, and I hope I am making the point clearly that the report does go very far, but what it's doing, and I think the intention, was mainly to suggest that the concept of self-determination can evolve further since the Second World War. And what they are trying to suggest here is that in relation to minorities and indigenous people, the evolution is for them to actually have a legal claim to self-government, territorial authority inside a state. So what I'm saying is that there's a nuance here. They don't want to talk about the more conservative definition of external self-determination, including independence, which they suggest is limited to the decolonization process and already existing states, the entire population of a already existing state. So I hope you understand the nuance here. So I'm not sure, it may not fall clearly in the direction that you would like to raise. However, if I can make one final point, which I think is the important issue here to keep in mind, what they are doing is to raise a discussion, a dialogue on we can actually change the concept of self-determination and move it to something more than what is perhaps the very conservative traditional approach which the United Nations has tended to adopt and to use. So I think that's the interesting door which it seems the government of Liechtenstein is opening here. They've only presented this report a few months ago, as I said, from their offices in New York. And I think, however, this provides perhaps an opportunity to organize something more, to perhaps have other governments, other organizations and civil society engage in that direction. And I think that has potential, because if you are a very traditionalist international lawyer, you'll know that in reality, there's a tendency to define self-determination in an extremely narrow way. So I hope I've answered your question, but also suggested that there might be some interesting possibilities here to work from that, because that's actually opening a very interesting door, which has never really been opened yet. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Next question, Miss Niruja. Unmute your mic. Niruja, unmute. Okay.
Thank you for the chance. My question to Fernandi Varens, special reporter. Thank you for your presentation. The question is, how nations and minorities who are on the situation because of wrong decolonization process can expect to be listed on the list of nations by decolonization committee?
Thank you very much. That's actually a complex question. It's very political because the states or the nations that are included in the decolonization list is determined within the structures of the United Nations by states. Other governments decide those former colonies or colonies that were included in the list. Unless, well, let me be very honest, unless you have a large number of governments, states that are members of the United Nations, unless you have a huge number of governments that are willing to do the diplomatic lobbying or effort to include or to recognize an entity on these decolonization lists, Unless you have that, it's not going to happen. And to be very honest, maybe some of you know this story. At one point, Hong Kong was on this list, and it was removed because diplomatically, and I'm hoping I'm not going to get too much in trouble for this, but the United Kingdom was not willing to fight the fight to ensure that Hong Kong remain on that list. That's my understanding, and I could be wrong about that. So to be very practical, unless you have a significant number of governments, of state governments who are members of the United Nations, willing to actually force, if you will, the opening up of that list to other, let's call them colonies or former colonies, that simply is not going to happen. It requires a huge amount of diplomatic effort. And I don't think the context is right currently, but that's my own understanding. And I have to admit, I'm not an expert on that particular field.
So thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Next question by Bimal from Canada.
Thank you for the opportunity. I have only 2 questions. I'm going to read both questions at the same time to our Mr. Fernand Warren. In your presentation, you also talked about preventing conflicts, that the international community is working on it. That's a beautiful thing, because conflicts is not good. I want to talk about Sri Lanka, that using more and more operations, military intimidations, and arbitrary detentions and arrests, and more land grabs and systemic genocide. Although the international community is working on preventing conflicts, these things are ignored, and there's no preventing action can be seen by the international community. I just wanted to know if I am wrong. And the second question is, seeking self-determination systematically created a larger conflict in Sri Lanka. And when a government create an amendment to its constitution to prevent and seeking right to self-determination as a terrorism act, how would these people seek their right to self-determination if it was prevented by a law, by a government? These are the 2 questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I didn't know about the second point you raised. I think if I could be very blunt, I think you are a bit harsh, severe. The United Nations, various entities within the United Nations have raised very grave concerns on the continuing, from what I understand, continuing exclusion, discrimination against, and even in some cases there are reports, allegations of atrocities and violence against minorities, particularly the Tamils. A few months ago, there was a major activity organized by a number of special rapporteurs, independent experts, focusing exclusively on Sri Lanka. And this was a public event, so I can mention it. And this public event organized by, I think, 3 or 4 special rapporteurs was very unusual. And the main agreement was that the Sri Lanka, the situation, particularly for the Tamils, are not improving. It's getting actually worse in a number of areas. My understanding is that also the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations has come out in the last year and a half on a number of occasions, raising visibility and expressing extremely grave concerns once again on how the situation is evolving in Sri Lanka. So I think there's been quite a few actions of that nature to try to indicate our discontent on the treatment of Tamils and other minorities in Sri Lanka. But, you know, the human rights section of the United Nations, we don't have an army. We cannot prosecute directly governments who do not want to cooperate. As you may know, the UN Security Council is the only entity within the United Nations that can actually adopt binding resolutions and take concrete action against a state, against a government. So it's a difficult situation where I would say the human rights mechanisms that we have are rather weak. We don't have many tools to work with to try to enforce the compliance with the international human rights. So, but it's not the same thing as saying we're not doing. I think we are doing quite a lot of actions, and we try to raise the visibility. Maybe we can do a lot more, but then that needs to be looked at. The second point that you raised, let me try to answer that very quickly. It's not for a government to decide who's a terrorist. Now that may sound a bit odd, but when we're talking about the United Nations, even if you have a government say this group or this kind of action is a terrorist action, that's not enough. That's not determinative. As a matter of fact, I have been involved in a number of situations where I've been attacked or criticized very aggressively by a government because of my contacts with minority groups. And a number of governments say, well, this minority group, which the Special Rapporteur de Varenne has been associated with, we consider this a terrorist group. The United Nations has its own determination. There is a list of organizations which we decide objectively, without any political influence, are terrorist groups that should be avoided. It's not by adopting a law that describes legitimate, nonviolent minority or indigenous people representatives and activists. It's not a government that can simply decide who's evil and who is not evil by adopting a law. That it's not the way the United Nations works, because you need to have objective, non-politicized determination of these issues. Otherwise, you're suppressing legitimate expression of grievances and denial of human rights. Thank you.
Yeah, for your invitation,
Thank you, sir.
I wanted to say that the 6th Amendment of the Sri Lankan Constitution preventing anyone or any group to seek right to self-determination.
Thank you. No, that is an interesting point. And my answer remains the same. You can't actually eliminate human rights just by adopting a law or even a modification of your constitution. Mm-hmm. Some governments have tried to do that by saying no minorities exist in the country, okay, even by a law. That has no impact at the international human rights level.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. With the last two questions, with that we'll wind up. The last two persons. The first one is Elam Sundaramurthy. Please, you can unmute your mic and then you can ask your question.
I guess he has to unmute yourself, Elan.
Unmute, Elan Sundaramurthy. Unmute your mic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's very informative webinar and very engaging informations. But here that I need to ask the UN official part, why the oldest cultures, oldest people, oldest languages are targeted by the people, or then the main issue is British colonization. The colonized nations are suffering right now, and is any structure behind it, or is anybody that is because of where all the problems when we see the oldest cultures being targeted? So wherever we go, is there any special programs are running about this? If you have any information, will be good.
Thank you. Yeah,
thank you for my opportunity.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I got all of the nuances of your question, but let me answer that. There are different sections of the United Nations that work very closely on issues such as hate speech. As you may know, hate speech, most of the targets of hate speech are actually minorities or indigenous people. There's also the special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General that deals with atrocities. And I raise hate speech and atrocities because these quite often occur in contexts of decolonization of former colonies. On the one hand, there's quite a few various initiatives of the United Nations and officials that are directly involved in areas of preventing conflict, addressing situations of even attempted genocide and mass atrocities, as I mentioned. But on the other hand, I think you have to realize that the decolonization process, the history of Europeans colonizing different parts of the world has left a mess around most of the world's region. The United Nations did not create these problems, these challenges of artificial borders. The colonization process quite often created pockets of poverty, of exclusion around the world, with the colonial powers draining the resources and growing rich on that. So in a sense, and you have to remember, the decolonization process is still a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only been, really, it started mainly in the late 1950s, 1960s. Historically speaking, that's not very long. So unfortunately, we'll be spending a huge amount of time trying to deal with all of the horrific mess and the negative consequences in many countries of the colonization experience. But we do have, the United Nations do have various offices and initiatives to try to deal with that, but to deal with that on the footing of equality, of respect, of the dignity, inherent dignity of everyone as human beings. Is it going to be easy? No, absolutely not. It's extremely complex, with a lot of resistance from different governments for various reasons. But at least we have a kind of a pathway by using the international human rights when these are understood and applied properly, which is still also a challenge, obviously, today. Thank you for that.
Thank you, sir. The next question from Princess Dora.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. I'm very impressed with the answers you talked about hate speech. I want to go to this question. Is the United Nations worried? Because when we talk of self-determination, is the United Nations visualizing many countries that, like us, the Southern Cameroon people, the Tamil people, thinking that if this process goes across, are they worried about microstates? That is one thing I'm worried about. And then the second question in relation to that is looking at the handbook of prevention and resolution of conflicts you mentioned by the Liechtenstein government. When I look at the population of Liechtenstein and the territory, it's amazing, but it's very stable. So I'm wondering whether they feel like microstates are going to be unstable, because I see a lot of small, nice countries like that, and they're doing good. Malta, Liechtenstein. Yeah, those are some of the worries.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and I want to also ask a question like, okay, how would they look at it with respect to people? What about the territory? Because let me take, for instance, the Southern Cameroon. The size of the Southern Cameroon is approximately the size of Norway, a country like Norway. And the population is more than 8 million to 10 million people. Yeah, should the people like that who have a problem remain on that kind of a brutality? I know the United Nations does not have an army, but at the same time, I'm wondering, what if the United Nations as a whole brings upon this big states or these minority groups that are trying to crush the minority people, like sanctions on them? Because those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. I'm also asking myself this question about micro states, like what about the United Nations making proposals like of federations, confederations that are working in the Western economy so that they can get rid of the conflicts and see how it can be diminished. Like you talked about the last 30 years, so many conflicts. That is my worry, because the more prolonged the conflict is, it looks like South Sudan. Oh, it's a failed state. They believe that us and the Tamil people will be failed people or failed states. but they forget to know that the longer the conflict is, the more people become radicalized. And you talked about hate speech. Hate speech is the cause of most of this radicalism we find. Those are the things that I'm thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you've put the finger on a number of issues. Let me just mention one. I think we have to, it's probably in the back of mind of a lot of people. At the United Nations, they have traditionally been extremely fearful, extremely scared of encouraging separatist movements. And so that's why you have a timidity at the United Nations to talk about situations of breaking up or encouraging in any way, any kind of separatist movement. We have to realize the United Nations is first and foremost an organization of states as recognized traditionally by the United Nations, a nation state almost. And so therefore, whenever you talk about even minorities having a right perhaps to self-determination, there has been a very traditional resistance to that. I don't think we should deny that. That's the reality of after the creation of the United Nations as an organization of states. I think we should not be naive. The United Nations was not created after the Second World War as an organization of human rights. It's not. You look at the Charter of the United Nations. It's a charter of a group of states that is actually very traditional based from a point of view of international law. But as the Liechtenstein report suggests, this might be changing because we've now recognized at least some form of self-determination for indigenous peoples. By the way, that's quite a step because you're actually saying, well, states are not the beginning or the end of everything, or states in a very traditional, rigid way. And that opens the door to perhaps also self-determination being expanded to minorities, which is not. That's actually quite a revolutionary suggestion being made there. Secondly, I like the issue of microstates that you mentioned, and microstates actually being stable. In fact, one of the most stable states in Europe has been Switzerland. Switzerland is a relatively smallish state in Europe, but it also is a state with 4 official languages, and it is a confederation. You have smaller units in that country that have a very, very, very high level of autonomy. It actually is one of the most stable states in the history of Europe. And in fact, when you start looking at smaller countries, there's nothing wrong with that. They tend to be quite often more egalitarian, more stable, I think. And there are reports that talk about that. But to encourage smaller countries in the world today, when you have a bigger country and maybe encourage smaller countries from that one big country, is a situation where you will have a lot of resistance because it would seem to suggest that you encourage separatism. And we're all adults here. We know that that is something that at the United Nations is not responded to very positively. I mean, we have to admit that. But we should be talking about self-determination because it can mean a number of other things. It can be a process which actually is more democratic, more reflective of the reality of the ground. That most countries, it's not just one people. You have different peoples, different communities. So is it only one state, one nation, one culture, or can we accept that we're diverse, and how can we make that work for everyone? So I'm sorry if I took a very long answer, but you raise a number of very interesting points, and thank you for that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. If you permit me, there's a last question from South Yemen. South Yemen, that's a Nasser Obey. Last question. So question from Nasser Obey, South Yemen, please. Unmute yourself for the last question.
Yeah, Nasser Obey from South Yemen. My friend also, Saleh, described shortly about the situation in Yemen, in South Yemen, exactly. Every time we just ask ourselves these important questions, maybe, if it is difficult to obtain the right to self-determination through the peace process, can it be obtained by imposing it by the force on the ground? Like, so in this case, maybe the questions, it comes, how will the international community deal with this situation? And we still remember two cases, Bosnia and Erbil. One of them accepted and one of them ignored totally. So,
you know, thank you very much for that. You know, as a, even though I'm not a UN official, I'm an independent expert with a mandate from the United Nations. So I cannot speak for the United Nations. I should have perhaps made that clearer. And I can never say, but I can never say anything like sometimes using violence can work. Because in a sense, your question was, well, can you can you resist and fight for your self-determination or independence? And of course, I can't say that that's an appropriate route. However, as you point out, there are situations where you have regions, part of a country, which starts a struggle for self-determination, and they eventually form an independent country. You mentioned Bosnia, which is the case. That happens, but let me just warn you about that. It happens if you have enough international support. In other words, you need also the governments of a large enough number of countries that accept that you are a member of the exclusive club of being a state in international human rights, in international law. Because if you think about Northern Cyprus is not considered to be a state in international law right now. Some would disagree with me, but certainly it's not considered to be a state. But Bosnia is. Kosovo is perhaps in the middle. We're not quite sure yet. So the short answer of your question is, unfortunately, the way it works is an exclusive club membership. And those who are members of this exclusive club already, those that are states recognized by the United Nations, they're the ones who can decide who's going to be let in as a member of this exclusive club. It's actually not very satisfying, but that's the way it is currently in international law. So I'll have to answer you in this way.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And really, I sincerely thank you for being with us for almost 2 hours and listening to 5 people. And then you are very patiently and very clearly and answered all the questions raised by the people. I'm really interested. There are some of people raised the hand, but since it's a time, I am extremely sorry for the people who are raised the hands, because it's a time. So therefore, I really sincerely thank you for enlightening us and guiding us on how to go about. And it is very interesting that you, out of your experience and out of your knowledge, and you are enlightened as a guidance. And I also thank all the speakers. So very beautifully, 5 speakers, really they have spoken well and really expressed their life realities from their own countries. And it is really, it is very, very good thing that you have done it. And you enlighten us how we need to collaborate each other. That's more important. That's what we need. This kind of sharing will enlighten us to go over, work together. So that's more important. And also, thank all the participants for patiently waiting and listening to these speakers and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on minority issues. And really, it is a good thing that you have been part of this program. I also thank all the media people, because they were covering the entire program. That's very, very interesting. And media people are till the last moment they have been with us and then covering the issues. I think that's a good thing. Therefore, I thank all the media people. Now I pass on to the session to Mr. Vimal Navarat from Canada for a concluding notes. Now over to Vimal.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a very productive gathering, and I would like to welcome the participation and your input to today's event. particularly Mr. Fernand Devarnas, Ms. Dora Gormain, and Ms. Lida Margosian, Foreign Affairs Minister, Armenian Occidental, Ms. Niruja Tavanesian from Finland, Mr. Saleh Alud, South Yemen, and also I would like to say that Mr. Kulandasamy wonderfully moderated this event. And this event has given us the opportunity to learn various ways that some countries denies the right to self-determination to a people. And from the information you all have provided today in this event, we hope that it will help us to move forward toward the fight to the right to self-determination of Elam Tamils. I believe that all of you will be continually support us to continue fight for the Elam Tamils and vice versa. And again, let us take all the note, particularly from Mr. Fernand Devarnas and Ms. Lydia Magosian. Let us see how we can basically move forward toward every nations who are fighting for the right to self-determination. We all know that it's a long fight. We have to stay put in this fight and talk to bring these issues to the international community and find a solution to those who is suffering, suffering and waiting for their right to self-determination. Thank you so much. Thank you again. We hope we will meet again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
So thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for now. Okay, so I'm going to close. Thank to all of you to be there, and we'll see to the next meeting. We try to program with the special rapporteur on independent international order. So I will let you know as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Thank you very much.